Good evening. I'm Alex Halliday. Welcome to the first Columbia Climate School Earth Series session of the new year. These monthly cutting-edge conversations feature the school's world-leading experts talking about the urgent issues that impact us all and their work to better understand these crises that we're facing. The Climate School is dedicated to preparing the next generation of climate response leaders ready to address the challenges of our changing planet now and into the future. The school now in the first weeks of our second semester is dedicated to answering three major questions. First, what is the future of the planet in 10, 30, 100 years from now? What's it going to look like if we carry on the way we're going, and how might that change in terms of, with different scenarios in terms of decarbonizing? The second is, what do we need to build to make that happen, and what does that look like? All the way we need to transition society to new ways of doing things. How's it all going to work? And then the third thing is, how do we go from where we are today to that point? And that difficult transition, which has to bring people and communities, many of whom are going to be suffering disproportionate impacts from climate change, without the least wherewithal to actually deal with it. So this requires new forms of knowledge. It also requires working in transdisciplinary teams. And so this school that we're building is different from a normal kind of school. It's immensely interdisciplinary, and it brings together the whole of Columbia University, because pretty much every part of Columbia University, in one way or another, is connected to the work on climate in the Climate School. So the stakes for this are extraordinarily high. And my guests this evening are tackling it in a particularly important way and focusing on one particular problem: atmospheric chemistry, quantifying airborne contaminants, and measuring the impacts of air pollution around the world, work that intersects with the causes of climate change and drives an urgent threat to human health. Faye McNeill is Columbia Professor of Chemical Engineering and Earth and Environmental Sciences. And Dan Westverelt is Assistant Research Professor at Columbia University's Lamont Doherty Earth Observatory. And they jointly lead an initiative called the Clean Air Toolbox for Cities. It is designed to wake us up to the dangers of air pollution by measuring these contaminants in high-risk parts of the world. Faye's research is focused on the fundamental chemistry and physics of atmospheric aerosol particles and ice in the environment, as well as modeling efforts to incorporate that molecular level knowledge into large-scale simulations of air quality and climate. Dan's research lies at the intersection of climate change, atmospheric chemistry, and air quality. His current research spans from air quality and climate modeling to deployment and calibration of low-cost sensors for air quality, with a particular focus on sub-Saharan Africa. He is an affiliate faculty member of the Columbia University Data Science Institute, an affiliated scientist with NASA Goddard Institute for Space Studies, and an air pollution advisor to the United States Department, the State Department. He is the Africa lead for the Clean Air Toolbox in particular. So Faye McNeill and Dan Westverelt, welcome. I thought I'd kick off with you, Faye. You are principal investigator of the Toolbox project, and your work focuses very much on the sources, chemistry, and physics of atmospheric aerosol and their roles in air quality and climate. What drew you into this area of research in the first place?
Thanks, Alex, and thanks for having us tonight to chat. I first became interested in atmospheric particles and air quality when I was studying as an engineering student at Caltech in my undergraduate years. My my academic advisor, so just a professor that I worked with, happened to be an aerosol scientist, and through conversations with him, I learned about these small particles in the atmosphere and their impacts on human health and the environment. I was very skeptical initially because, we don't experience, we can't see the particles with our eyes. It sounded, questionable how important this could be. But, as I'm an asthmatic and living in Pasadena, California, in the 90s, it was definitely still very polluted there. And I felt the physical effects of the pollution. You could see it with your eyes. I quickly started to understand just how important and vital this area was for study. At the same time, in my engineering education, I was learning about the basic physics of particles and mass transfer and chemistry and all that was just so elegant and challenging and interesting. And this combination of everything just really got me hooked on this area of research.
Thanks, Faye. So Dan, let's hear a little introduction from you. What got you into this? You are particularly focused on Africa, of course. How does this this project fit into your career? And how did you get interested in atmospheric science in the first place?
Yeah, thanks, Alex. So similar to Faye, I have a background in engineering, and it was kind of in the middle of my engineering curriculum in college when I stumbled upon a class that was talking about environmental sustainability and green engineering and things like that. And at that time, to me, and probably to a lot of people, it was a bit of a newer field. And so I ended up taking this class thinking that, I could at least get a good grade probably. And it ended up being a real passion of mine that really took off and really got me interested in the idea of mitigating air pollution and ultimately in the motivation of doing something about climate change and people's health. And then specifically in Africa, a little bit of by chance, I became, as you mentioned, an advisor to the U.S. State Department, and they assigned me to a post in the Congo. And I just sort of took it from there and was able to sort of turn what started out as sort of a side gig into more of a career focus and career direction. So.
Sounds great. So Faye, tell us about the Clean Air Toolbox. What is it exactly?
Sure. So the Toolbox initiative is, it's really something that was born from the Earth Institute, and now is, I feel very aligned with what the climate school is about. So we're, people at Columbia. It's a very interdisciplinary group, more than 20 research groups that really span across Columbia's many campuses. So I'm in engineering, Dan's at Lamont. We also have people in the law school, public health, the medical school, SEPA, and of course, people in the climate school. We're all working together to improve air quality in cities in the global south. And this was an initiative that was really started by the Earth Institute. It was catalyzed. We were a group of people who were all working on air pollution from our own angles and our own little academic corners of the world. And Earth Institute came to us and said, well, what if you put your heads together and really tried to move the needle in a particular location in terms of reaching impact with cleaner air, what would you do? And that just got the ball rolling, and we've taken it from there.
So explain what the end game is, because we all like to take our research and see it play out and maybe be vaguely relevant to people, but this is very much a focused project trying to transform people's lives in a very practical way. How could this project lead to the political will to make crucial change in the world?
Yeah, so that when we initially got together and brainstormed, we developed, what we call in the business a theory of change. So, how is what we're going to do actually going to make a difference? And for the Clean Air Toolbox, our vision really starts with data. So millions of people in the most populous parts of the world are impacted by, air pollution that's just really above healthy levels. And in many of those same locations, there's actually not much or there's actually no data on the ground to quantify what they're being exposed to, what the health impacts of that daily exposure are, what are the long-term economic impacts to their society of that exposure. And without those numbers, it's very difficult to mobilize politically and justify the kind of investment that it takes to reduce emissions and make those policy changes. So by starting with strategies for quantifying what are people being exposed to, what's in the air, where is it coming from, that's a very important first step towards getting the ball rolling politically.
I see. Dan, do you want to tell us a bit about what you've already figured out? Last year, I gather, I know you uncovered some vital data, and your research described the very first air quality profile in two major sub-Saharan African cities. Tell us all about that. What did you find out?
Sure. So, kind of as you alluded to, the amount of data that's available for air pollution that's affecting people's health in sub-Saharan Africa is very sparse. There's just not a lot of it out there. And so we've been collecting data in a number of different cities, but I sort of got my start working in a city of Kinshasa, which is the capital of the Democratic Republic of the Congo, and it's a city of about 14 million people. It's very close to another city that's in the Republic of Congo, which is a different country. The city is called Brazzaville, and it's also got a few million people. So together there's about 17 million people. And we started collecting data on fine particulate matter, small particles, there in about 2018. And so we found that the levels of particulate matter were about 5 times higher than the healthy levels that would be guidelines from, for example, the World Health Organization, or the kind of levels that would be standards here in the US by the EPA. So we found that to be pretty alarming, and we've kind of had some follow-up studies on this as well that we're looking forward to getting into.
So what changes have come from these findings? What do you want to see happen now?
Yeah, well, as you mentioned, this was probably, as to our knowledge, and we searched pretty hard, but this was to our knowledge the first attempt to measure air pollution in this major city that's only going to grow more. By some projections, it might be one of the largest cities in the world by the end of the century. So to preface it a little bit, the change has been slow, but one thing that has come from this kind of work is that we've found a stronger commitment from bilateral organizations, such as the US State Department, who have now kind of woken up to the idea of monitoring air quality in this city, partially because they want to protect the health of their own diplomats, but also for sort of the greater good of knowing what the air pollution is like. So we found more engagement. There's more measurement campaigns being planned with the State Department and also the local universities there, who are kind of working hand in hand. And then ideally in the future, what we'd like to see is, we would like to see this lead to mitigation policies and air quality management plans, and ways that can directly impact and improve people's health. That's a slower task, but I think we're getting the first steps, and I think we can make the rest of it happen soon.
Okay, so maybe, before I go on, just to let people know that to ask questions, put them in the chat, and use the Q&A function, and we will curate these and actually bring them together and there'll be time for 15 minutes of discussion at the end. Anyway, so back to you two, but to both of you, really, much of the work you do with the Clean Air Toolbox hinges on building on those on-the-ground relationships, rather like you're talking about, Dan, I guess. How do you approach this? What are the obstacles and benefits of working with stakeholders? And I know lots of organizations try and do this. ICAP does this around disease around the world, from Columbia University, and of course the International Research Institute for Climate and Society focuses on climate change impacts. How do you actually go about doing it yourselves?
Yeah, this is really core to our philosophy at the Clean Air Toolbox. From the beginning, we've established that partnerships on the ground would be totally essential to our success, and also that's the way that we wanted to do science, was with our local partners in the lead. We really want to avoid this paradigm of people coming from the West, taking data, publishing it in some paywalled journal, and the only people really benefiting from that activity is their careers, not really the people who are affected by that air pollution, right? We didn't want to be that parachute scientist scenario. It's also just obvious that if you want to have an impact, you need to have buy-in from local decision makers. And if you want to have lasting impact, having local scientists, local technical people in the lead who can take ownership of the equipment that we're setting up, and then carry on beyond the time that we're actively involved in those places. This is the way to have lasting impact. And so this was an ambitious vision that we set out initially, and I thought that this would be one of the bigger challenges of what we do, figuring out who these partners would be and building those relationships. And actually it's, to my pleasant surprise, it's been the opposite. Every city that we've worked in, we're seeing just tons of enthusiasm and desire for the kind of help that we can offer technically to address these air pollution problems that the people are facing. So that's been nice. It's also been very vital through the last 2 years. We kicked off this project right before COVID started. So basically like late summer 2019. And, Dan and I were, really aggressive, and we traveled a lot between then and the beginning of COVID and built those relationships, set up our initial networks, sensor networks, but also, the networks of people who were partners in what we're doing. And because we laid that groundwork at that time, our local partners have been able to carry on what we're doing, even though we haven't been able to travel as much as we would, have planned during these times. So,
yeah, Dan?
Yeah, and I'll just add, I agree that with Faye that there's been really great enthusiasm, and that's been really rewarding and good to see. There's certain aspects of the work that literally are require local knowledge and local expertise. And an example, we obviously we can't be in these locations all the time, but our colleagues there, often tell us like, okay, we witnessed a bunch of waste burning, trash burning locally near a lot of our different sensors over these last few weeks. Maybe we can jointly take a look at the data and see kind of if we're seeing any signal for that. So the local knowledge from the local stakeholders has just been really essential and key to keeping things moving forward.
So tell me a little bit about science funding side for this, because this is very much applied science. I mean, I know you're developing techniques that are crucial, but actually a lot of what you're trying to do is to actually really roll these things out around the world. Where do you go to for getting funding for this? Is there a sort of gap in terms of the normal places that you can go to? Is it difficult?
Yeah, I mean, I think that there are the traditional, funding sources like the National Science Fund, the federal agencies. Definitely, we've had, some luck there. It can be difficult, though. I think a lot of the federal money is tied to certain restrictions and things like that. And one of the big challenges is just making sure that our local scientists have the resources that they need to continue the great work, because like I said, we can't really do it without them.
Right. Faye, when we consider the number of deaths attributed each year to air pollution up to 9 million, it is shocking to many of us. And so, I mean, it strikes me, because I know we're not showing visuals, but you do have that amazing map of the number of sensors monitoring air pollution around the world. And you see this, America's got tons of this stuff, and yet these massive gap all over Africa is hardly anything. Actually, a number of countries don't do it. Even countries that actually have quite advanced economies don't necessarily don't take it seriously enough. And of course, within the EU, there's been a big push on this over the last decade. Do you feel this is an underappreciated health risk? Do people not realize how serious this is?
Yeah, absolutely. I would agree with that. Sometimes air pollution is called an invisible crisis. Of course, if you've experienced severe air pollution, like what you can see in my Zoom background, that's just an average day in Mumbai, or you can see in Dan's Zoom background showing Nairobi, obviously you can see it sometimes if it's getting bad enough. But, I think that what that's referring to is the way that the health effects work, right? So it is a killer, as you said, leading to premature deaths in the millions. And sometimes you can have acute health effects from exposure to air pollution. Like I have asthma, so I can, feel the acute effects of my asthma. But a lot of the health effects that air pollution is associated with happen over a long time. And it's sometimes difficult to pinpoint, okay, this case of COPD was certainly caused by air pollution. And so for that reason, it's sometimes I would say it might be more difficult than, for example, waterborne illness to keep in people's minds. The other thing is that the places where we're working, they're facing not only air pollution in terms of their challenges, right? So there might be food scarcity, poverty, water quality, all COVID, we're all facing COVID. There's this kind of hierarchy of crises, and sometimes air pollution is viewed as a luxury to be able to worry about it. I think that that is how it is. I don't think that we should give into that logic, though, because improving public health to that degree, we're reducing that much impact, should definitely be a priority.
So where is, Dan, maybe you should answer this, where is most of the pollution coming from? I mean, what are the sources of air pollution, the emitters that we need to, the main ones in Africa?
Yeah, I think that there's uniqueness to every location, but I can try to, outline some common denominators. And I think one that is quite common in sub-Saharan Africa and also in places in South Asia is open burning. And it's really burning of a lot of different stuff. The more traditional thing is just burning solid fuels, wood, charcoal, things like that, to provide energy for cooking, heating in certain times of year in certain locations. All that, of course, emits a lot of particulate matter and air pollution. But another thing that actually, happens a lot, which I didn't realize until I was really in depth into this, was burning of trash, burning of waste. And so there's just a lot of major cities, like in Kinshasa, for example, they don't really have a robust waste management system. They don't really collect the trash, and they don't have the recycling, and the places that they do, it's just not very well enforced. And so people just resort to sort of burning it to get rid of it. And obviously that's not going to be good for health. So, that's a big one. Of course, we have lots of traffic in lower and middle income countries. So you have lots of vehicular pollution. Another thing about the vehicles, especially in Africa, is that they're usually in the twilight of their lifetime. They've been maybe used somewhere else in a wealthier country and then shipped over. So they don't typically have all the latest maintenance and upkeep and things like that. And so they can be more polluting than typical. Yeah. Okay.
So I kind of feel it's inevitable we should be talking about wildfires as well, which are not just an issue for Africa. So last summer in the US, wildfire smoke from Canada and the West spread all the way across the country, and creating haze and sort of unhealthy air quality as far away as New York and Pennsylvania, as we know. Was this surprising to you? Is this something that we need to be thinking about for the future? And what are going to be the dangers associated with this phenomenon, given that we're going to be probably living with wildfires a lot more as the planet warms?
Yeah, I think that the long range transport itself wasn't necessarily that surprising to the atmospheric scientists. What definitely was surprising, though, was just the magnitude of the fires themselves out west. The fact that there were so many of them and for so long. And it was fairly interesting, at least to me, that the smoke was able to descend down close to the surface as well as it did in that particular case that happened or last year. So, I guess being aware of the fact that air pollution is not just confined to your individual borders and your home state or your country is something that people should be aware of.
Yeah. Faye?
Yeah. I'll just also add, the air pollution levels that we're seeing right in the vicinity of these fires, they're as bad as the emergency episodes that we see in Delhi during the winter. This extremes of air pollution, it's not just a problem that's happening far away from us. And honestly, I think that this is the biggest air quality problem that we're facing domestically right now.
So you mean basically nearby where the fires are, rather than actually over here in New York?
Right. So I'm thinking of, for example, there was the Camp Fire, and there was the plume that covered a lot of the East Bay, or the Bay Area of San Francisco. The air quality wasn't good here either, but over there it was an emergency.
Okay. So and are people aware of what this is doing to their health in the region, like in California, and
I
or
think just anecdotally, I mean, so I lived part of my life in the Bay Area, so I still have a lot of friends who live there, and a lot of them were experiencing asthma for the first time in their lives, or people who had asthma, they were feeling flare-ups. They were seeking advice about air purifiers and wearing masks and this kind of thing. So actually, a lot of people I know who live in that area that are very affected by fires, they already had a stock of N95 masks in their home before COVID because they have been dealing with this problem for a while already.
oh my gosh,
Yeah.
right. So Faye, carrying on with you, you're also working, this project is also integrated or connected with the Clean Air Catalyst program, which is, can you tell us a bit about that? And this, it's a very large collaboration, if I understand it correctly. And is it, how much is it going to change things?
Yeah, the Clean Air Catalyst is something really interesting and unique. So it's a large project that's being funded by USAID, very international. The lead organizations are the World Resources Institute and the Environmental Defense Fund, WRI and EDF. And they have a vision of attacking not just the technical barriers to having cleaner air, like which is our main focus, but also the political barriers and the social challenges, tackling all these things simultaneously to make a quick change in a location. And so if that sounds challenging, it is. It's a massive effort to coordinate the scientists and the social scientists and the political scientists and the local teams on the ground and the global team and everything. But it's really ambitious. It's really exciting. We're working as a team in Indore in India, in Jakarta, Indonesia, and then they're planning on starting a pilot in East Africa sometime next year.
Oh, great. So could you also tell us a little bit about how, I mean, of course, we recognize wildfires are to some extent related to climate change, and we also realize that certain kinds of energy use energy generation are related to pollution, atmospheric pollution. But what is the actual, is there a real relationship between air pollution and climate change? And what does that really look like? I don't know whether Dan, you could answer that maybe, in terms of atmospheric chemistry. And how does that relate to the policies that are needed around climate change?
Yeah, well, I think at the highest level, air pollutants are the drivers of climate change. And so most people think of carbon dioxide as being a driver of climate change. And this is maybe not a traditional air pollutant in the sense that it directly gets breathed into your lungs and goes into your bloodstream and makes you have lung issues and things like that. But it does, of course, cause climate change with this negative effects. And so it can be sort of viewed as an air pollutant. But really the other air pollutants that we define as kind of more traditional air pollutants, like particulate matter, which is what we've been talking about a lot here tonight, those are also agents of climate change. And so depending on their chemical makeup, they can either enhance warming at the surface of the earth, or they can actually have an opposite effect where they cause more cooling and sort of have an overall decrease on the global mean surface temperature. So yeah, they're really, air pollutants are really driving, I would say, climate change.
Yeah, okay. So are you hopeful that the increased concerns around climate change will actually trigger important changes in policies to stem air pollution levels, or how do you see those two things working together?
Yeah, I think, the heart of the question is that air pollutants and air pollution policy or air quality policy and climate policy are really, really interconnected, and they must be that way. If anyone's going to make sound policy on one, then the other is going to be impacted. And so a great example is a lot of the policies that people discuss for reducing CO2 also reduce the traditional air pollutants, particulate matter, things like that, because a lot of them have the same sources. They come from fossil fuels, they come from our cars and our human activities and things like that. So there's a really good opportunity here to feature what we call co-benefits of climate change policy with improvements in air quality.
Yeah. So I was wondering if we should talk a little bit about things close to home, New York, which of course is a fabulous city and the greatest city in the world, according to some. And it's a wonderful place to be. So we're all very happy living in New York. But there was also a study that was done showing that actually the reduced air pollution in New York had saved a lot of lives. I think it was 5,660 lives were saved in New York State in 2012 compared to 2002. So I'm not sure how they did that work. You can probably tell us about it, but this is quite significant. Are there, you know, on the local level, people can actually count those numbers and think that's a lot of people who didn't die. So are there similar examples of that? And what do you feel is important for leaders to understand about this in terms of protective actions and results? I mean, maybe something, of course, for other places, but.
Yeah. So that study was done by a colleague of ours here at Lamont in the climate school. And, you know, just to give another example is the Clean Air Act in the United States, which started in the 1970s and still kind of carries its weight today, has saved millions of lives. It's been around for over 50 years. And by reducing air pollution levels, just in the same way that you kind of described over New York State, that's happened, you know, around the country. And really not only just the health benefits, but there's been economic benefits as well. So, you know, by saving money on medical expenses and by having greater productivity for the American workers with these lower health burdens from air pollution, you know, the Clean Air Act has sort of paid for itself many times over. So I think that's probably what I would let leaders know is that, you know, reducing pollution not only saves people's lives, but it's really a no-brainer because it kind of is a very successful economic piece of legislation as well.
Yeah.
If I can interject for a second.
Oh, sure.
You know, a lot of the places that we're working in are undertaking the challenges of development at the same time as facing down the fact that they have a major public health crisis on their hands, right? And so, you know, often there's these competing goals of wanting to electrify, you know, reap the benefits of a strong industry and all that kind of thing. And one of the interesting statistics about the Clean Air Act I've seen is, you know, all of those markers for the US went up at the same time as the Clean Air Act success was going on, you know, like miles driven, the GDP, all that, you know, it didn't slow down success and development in the US. So. Yeah.
Oh, that's great. So let's get back to the Clean Air Toolbox. So tell us what's ahead for it in 2022. And, you know, I'm very excited about this year. There's so much going to be happening this year, but you must be excited as well. Tell me what you're going to be doing in 2022 and what would help you the most to get the more meaningful results and have more impact. Dan, do you want to kick off?
Sure, yeah, I can kick off. Sorry about the. So yeah, I think for me personally, I'll be traveling a little bit to Africa a few times this calendar year. One of the things that we're going to hope to do more of this calendar year is capacity building, training, providing, you know, the hands-on, hopefully in-person type of training and capacity building for folks in lower and middle income countries so that they can, you know, become sort of experts in their own right and start to deal with these air pollution problems in their home countries. So we'll be doing a lot of that, and you know, we'll continue to sort of disseminate our research to the public through things like the traditional ways, like open access peer-reviewed journal articles, but also social media, websites, public lectures, town halls, things like that. Yeah, and I think, you know, in terms of what can help, you know, I think, as I alluded to earlier, it's important to keep the folks that are on the ground, you know, able to continue to do their work. And you know, if that can mean various types of resources like equipment, which is often desperately lacking in Africa and other lower and middle income countries. So it's that, you know, some of that state-of-the-art air pollution equipment is sort of crucial to often move the needle to get air pollution action.
Okay, Faye?
Yeah, I second everything that Dan said. I would say it's a really fun time in the project because we've got momentum now. We're gaining traction, working in lots of cities. We just need to kind of keep it going, follow through on all this great stuff that we've initiated. As Dan alluded earlier, it's easier to support parts of the project than others, right? So, for example, getting equipment has proved to be a little bit easier than supporting the scientists who are needed to design the experiments, analyze the data, all like that. Especially, we want to support young scientists, both to help keep the project going, but also in the spirit of capacity building and training the next generation of air quality scientists here and in the cities where we're working.
So that's interesting. So you're saying that funding agencies or foundations tend to want to support equipment and kits. They don't actually want to support the people and the young people to do the work.
Right. And it's to be honest, the human equipment, all of us are a bit more expensive in a way, than, for example, we're often working with low cost air pollution sensors.
Yeah.
It's designed to kind of have a low overhead, but all that scientific magic that goes into getting really high quality data out of it, that needs to come from the scientists.
Okay, well, you all heard it here first. We need money for people, so that's great. So both of you, we should move on to questions from the audience in a minute. But before I do, I always ask my guests to give me a little bit, just a sort of short takeaway message. We've covered a lot of stuff tonight. What number one takeaway do you want to make sure the audience leaves understanding around the importance of this work? What do you think they should really remember? Dan, do you want to kick off?
Sure. I'd just say that air pollution and climate change are going to hit the most vulnerable populations in the global south and lower and middle income countries, especially hard if we don't do something about it.
Yeah. Faye, what do you think?
I would say that we're at a very interesting time in history with regards to air pollution and climate. For obvious reasons, people are thinking more about the air that they breathe than ever before, right? So many more people know about particles in the air, for other reasons, COVID related mainly. Also, some dramatic changes that we saw in air pollution in some locations during the COVID lockdowns, things like that. Awareness is basically at an all-time high of the issues that we're talking about. And it's kind of this inflection point where if we make the right changes now, we can, prevent those millions of premature deaths and also kind of put the brakes on climate change, through these kind of actions which have co-benefits, which Dan mentioned earlier. So now's the perfect time to be doing this work, and now's the perfect time for action.
So that's great, fantastic. And they are so closely linked, the action on climate change and the action on air pollution. And of course, it's been palpable in certain parts of the world where there's been a need to move forward. Before going to the audience, one of the things that always struck me as a bit odd is that we always said that diesel had a lot of the diesel vehicles had lower emissions than petrol vehicles, and so there's a big push in Europe, and particularly in the UK, to actually switch to diesel. But actually, nobody sort of woke up to the fact that this is causing a lot of extra pollution. So at some level, this was people were very happily trying to improve their carbon footprint without realizing they were causing air pollution that was affecting people's lives. Is this something that people have been aware of in America as well, or is it very much a British thing?
I think that this is a classic problem that happens in policy all the time. You can come up with another example, which is America has done an amazing job of cleaning up the sulfur dioxide emissions from our power plants, right? Yeah. So when you burn coal or other fossil fuels that have sulfur in them, it creates sulfur dioxide, which ultimately leads to acid rain and sulfate particles. Yeah. And, so addressing that in the US over the last 30, 40 years has been a huge, huge win for air quality in the US. But what was done was SO2 was reduced without reducing CO2 emissions from the same activities, right? So that was a case where air quality, or actually acid rain, was the main target that was being hit with the policy. That was happening totally without any regard for climate, because that was decades ago and that wasn't exactly part of the conversation yet. This thing where only part of the problem is being tackled at once, this myopia that happens, it's unfortunately quite common. And I don't know how to address it other than more communication among these different specialty groups that are focusing on one problem or the other.
Okay, great. Sounds like you need a climate school. So, so let's get some questions from the audience. So there's a few coming in that there's a load of questions coming in. So I'm afraid we can only go through a few of these. We're not going to get through them all. So I think we should try and be fairly quick in our response so that we can get through as many as possible. One person asked about Jakarta in particular, and where the air is really bad. You mainly been talking about Africa, of course, but you did mention Jakarta, I think, in one of the areas that's of interest. Tell us a little about what's going on in these other parts of the world to really address these issues. I mean, China's the other obvious place where there's actually movement to decarbonize, driven by the air pollution issues that are caused by coal-fired power stations. Can you give us a little bit of a clue of how this is being addressed globally? Or does this relate to this big organization thing that you talked about before?
I can try to tackle that. So the reality is that each one of these locations that you've mentioned is at a different stage in the arc of dealing with air quality as a problem. So China, that journey started in the early 2000s in terms of awareness of air quality being a problem, air pollution data being generated and shared publicly. And so therefore, and this actually was catalyzed in some way by the actions of the US Embassy right there, right? So they installed the same kind of air pollution monitor that we have here with all of our EPA monitors, and started publicly posting the data. And that placed pressure on the government to make more measurements. The public sharing of that data caused the public to start to place more pressure on the government. And this was, a decade, 15 years or so of process, along with, investment in science and understanding the sources of pollution. And now China's turning a corner in terms of improving their air quality. Other places that we're working, they're just barely starting, right? So many of the places that Dan is working, there's no air quality data on the ground, and it's very early days of raising awareness of the problem at all. Places like India are in between, where it's well acknowledged that there's a big problem, and we're kind of side by side with the local pollution control boards and decision makers, saying like, how can we support you in addressing this? How can we use new technology to enhance, what you're doing already? How can we help you identify the sources that are the right ones to be tackling with policy? I would say Jakarta is a little bit earlier on that side. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Okay. So in this context, it relates to another question from the audience. Is the Clean Air Toolbox expanding its work, research, and cooperation on the international scale? So are you going to be engaging more globally as an organization, or are you going to stay very much focused on the situation in Africa? Dan?
Yeah, I could take a stab at that. I mean, I think we have to be a little careful because, Faye and I are only two people, and we don't want to completely overburden ourselves and spread ourselves too thin. But yeah, I think as Faye mentioned, one of the questions, we are sort of going into other places, and we started out mostly thinking about India and just a couple countries in sub-Saharan Africa, and now we have gone to many different countries in sub-Saharan Africa, and we've also added some countries in Southeast Asia, like Indonesia, Jakarta. So yeah, I think that is on the horizon to work in other places.
Is there
we do kind of look at this as a global project, and we're working in 3 kind of different regions at this time. And if resources open up to, say, work in Latin America or some other part of the world, like Dan said, as long as we're not spreading ourselves so thin that we're not making progress on the other areas, if it's good support, then definitely we'll branch out.
So somebody raised the issue of Flint, Michigan, and of course, what you think about with Flint, Michigan is water, but there are atmospheric pollution area issues there as well, I guess. Do you quite often find these things are related, that you find that the places that are suffering the worst water pollution are also the ones who haven't actually got the process in place to deal with air pollution? Or do you think they tend to be just completely decoupled? I mean, there's certainly, in some countries, you've seen massive water pollution issues alongside what's been going on in particulars.
I can take a stab at that one. So I think I wouldn't say it's kind of a one-to-one correlation, but I think that there is definitely some major overlap between different types of environmental problems that happen in the same areas. And one of the common denominators, at least in my understanding, is that unfortunately it comes down to places that are underprivileged. If we're talking about the U.S., they may have been exposed to certain types of past policies that made bad situations come in present day. But more globally, I think the lower and middle income countries are kind of facing a whole host of different environmental problems that can sort of unfortunately compound and build off each other.
Right, got it. So somebody else has asked about, so it's quite interesting after I mentioned what went on in the UK with diesel. Someone's saying, are there policies, technologies for mitigating climate change that would actually issues?
Alex, it looks like you froze for a minute. Could you repeat that?
Oh, sorry. Okay. Are there policies and technologies for mitigating climate change that would actually make air pollution worse? And are there any trade-offs between making progress in both of these important environmental issues and areas?
Well, I think that one thing you have to be careful about is, I mentioned this cooling effect of aerosols. And so if you remove those aerosols that provide cooling, which you probably want to do because they're killing people, they're causing human health issues, you could unmask or sort of reveal some additional warming. And so I think that's why, as I stressed in the questions, that really climate policy, air quality policy have to be coupled. You have to target sources and target sectors that will have sort of win-win conditions for both air quality and climate change, so that you don't accidentally mitigate one problem and cause another to be worse.
Yeah, I think that the approaches that seem really solid for co-benefits often involve the design phase, right? So, and this is an interesting opportunity in countries that are electrifying, right? If more investment is made in renewable sources of electricity from the beginning, rather than investment in fossil fuels, which then has to be cleaned or mitigated in some way, it's an opportunity if that's feasible financially. I will say my group has done some research on solar geoengineering. So this idea of releasing aerosol particles into the stratosphere to cause cooling, like on a short time scale, is kind of one of the tools of slowing down climate change.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I'm not designing this or I'm not a proponent of it by any stretch, but my group has the techniques to be able to measure what the impacts on the atmospheric chemistry of the stratosphere would be if we were to do that.
Mm-hmm.
And what you may or may not know is the ozone hole is connected to chemistry that takes place on the surface of particles in the stratosphere. So, we atmospheric scientists look for, are there any potential unintended consequences? Stratospheric ozone is not exactly air quality, but it's one of those environmental externalities that we definitely don't want to bring upon ourselves if we can help it. So we're always kind of trying to keep an eye out for things like that.
Right. Got it. So there's another question just coming in around the New York Times story today. And there's a quote, even low levels of soot can be deadly to older people, research finds. The 4-year air pollution study, which followed 68.5 million older Americans, was the first of its kind. Is there any relationship between what you're doing and the kind of work that goes in at that level? And do you have any comments on this kind of work? Because low levels of soot must be something that, I mean, you find soot everywhere, right? So it's getting into the Arctic and polluting the whole biosphere. So presumably everybody's being affected to some extent. It's affecting their health, older people.
Certainly. I mean, so a big component of the Clean Air Toolbox are our colleagues from the Mailman School of Public Health, who are involved in epidemiological studies like that. I haven't read this particular article yet. I'll probably read it in bed after this. But it doesn't surprise me at all to hear a report like that. You know, it seems like as research tries to target, you know, what is a safe level of pollution, they're kind of not able to find one in terms of one that has no impact on human health, right? And you know, part of what happens with soot and other what we call PM 2.5, the smallest part of the aerosol population, those particles aerodynamically are able to get into the deepest part of your lungs, where through phagocytosis, they're incorporated into your bloodstream, and then they can travel to all parts of the body system. So, you know, you may read a news report that says air pollution is connected with Alzheimer's, or it's connected with diabetes, or it's connected with reproductive health. And, you know, initially I thought, is this some statistics game that's being played? You know, is it something's being missed by these analyses? But no, actually, physiologically, there are mechanisms that, you know, these particles just get transported all over your body, and they can impact any body system. So,
wow,
yeah.
There's another question here which I think is quite relevant, particularly when we're talking about climate change, because we think of carbon dioxide as, you know, being emitted, and it hangs around in the atmosphere for decades, and actually a significant fraction of it hangs around for hundreds of years. So, which is why we're building up problems for ourselves on such a long time scale. It takes such a long time to actually come back down. But in air pollution, does stuff hang around as well? Or you know, if you take action on air pollution, how quickly do you actually see an improvement of atmospheric chemistry that will affect people's lives?
Yeah, it depends a little bit on the pollutant, but the good news is that most of them are much shorter lived than CO2. The typical particulate matter that we've been referring to can last in the atmosphere for an average of maybe 7 days, 5 to 7 days. So the results can be pretty quick. And, you know, there's other pollutants that aren't necessarily as quick as that, but particulate matter is the one that kills the most people. So there's good news on that policy front for sure.
Okay. So there's a lot of other questions coming in, some of them around carbon-free electricity in particular. So to what extent, when we actually talk with countries, maybe this is sort of building upon this, when we talk with countries about how to switch to renewables and things like that, to what extent do you think air pollution factors as a sort of a key part of this, as a key consideration? Or do you find that in general, these things are totally decoupled in terms of people's thinking?
Well, I wish Jason Bordoff or somebody from CJEP was here with us to answer this specific question about the energy industry. I think it's my impression is that the decision is complicated, and it often involves finance more than anything else. So what kind of energy are they able to get financing for to start that production? And that's way outside my wheelhouse. Everybody should be thinking about air quality and climate when making these decisions, though, if possible. And, you know, if there are financial barriers, you know, the people who are closer to that area should be thinking about how to disrupt that to solve that part of the problem.
And is there some way to sort of put on the scale, you know, which things are the worst things to burn in terms of your health? So plastics versus coal versus or other kinds of pollutants that are going up there, like diesel, etc.? Is there sort of, is there a fairly clear scale of which are the worst things, and if you like, the things that we should be most concerned about in terms of the things we're dumping into the atmosphere?
Absolutely. It just depends on what you're specifically looking at, but people have been looking into these kinds of emissions factors, and you can compare the emission of the various pollutants that we're mainly concerned about for public health compared to the energy density of the fuel. And yeah, we don't want to be burning garbage for sure.
So one other question here is about CFCs and how much they've changed over time. So, of course, this was one of the most amazing examples of international agreement to change the way we do things. How successful has that been? Do you think there are ways in which we can learn from the protocols that were put in place to control CFCs?
Yeah, so I mean, I think as you said, it has been quite successful. I think that one of the, not to take too much away from the success, but it's unfortunately the truth that it was a little bit easier to accomplish those removals because there was a very capable replacement refrigerant and other, industrial chemical that was about the same economic value, and it was very straightforward to sort of substitute it in there. So I think that there are definitely lessons that could be learned from climate change, but unfortunately with climate change, it's a tad bit more difficult because it requires really disrupting a lot of, what we kind of have gotten used to over, decades and decades of life. So yeah, it's a little bit more challenging, but I think we need to be up for the challenge and really put our heads to it. And I guess that's why we have a climate school.
Right.
Yeah, I would just add the Montreal Protocol is touted as one of the most successful international agreements of any kind, let alone in environmental success. I mean, it's just fantastic. And, as Dan said, there was this close partnership with industry where, the industries that were going to be the most affected were actually partners in, that transition. So when CFCs were banned, there wasn't so much friction on their side. And also behind the scenes, the work that scientists did to pinpoint the CFCs as being the cause of what was happening, there was just this gorgeously clear smoking gun data that was taken by Jim Anderson and his group at Harvard, where they flew through the Arctic vortex, or the polar vortex, and saw the changes in chlorine chemistry as they were going through the ozone hole. And there was really nothing else that could be causing that problem at the time. So while many scientists, since Arrhenius, for hundreds of years, we've known that CO2 in the atmosphere and other greenhouse gases have been a problem in terms of climate. The conversation has been different, and it has been easier to muddy in terms of the scientific backing. Hopefully we're a little bit beyond that, but we've lost a few decades of progress that could have been made because of that.
Yeah, I mean, the whole, the New York Times photograph of the ozone hole is quite a dramatic thing. It connects with the people immediately, and carbon dioxide doesn't, as a long-term thing that we need to worry about in the future, it doesn't quite have the same visceral connection, which has been part of the problem with the communication. We are out of time, I'm afraid. This has been fantastic. It's been really great to talk with you, and there's loads more questions. I'm sorry we can't, I can't answer them all. I'd like to thank Faye and Dan for a fascinating discussion, and as well as thank you very much for the work you do, which is incredibly important. Thanks to everybody else who's been listening in and contributing for joining us. This is an urgent time, and we do ask that you consider supporting our vital work by making a gift, in particular, in this case, Faye and Dan's work. Your support will lead to directly the development of new knowledge, which is incredibly important in understanding the climate system, but also how it's impacting our planet and what we need to do about it. So your support will advance the climate school and what we're trying to do, as well as our students, of course, and who will be our future leaders in this area. So please help us in any way you feel you can. when you support the Climate School, you support the future of life on Earth. And we look forward to next month's Earth Series event, which is when I'll be joined by co-founding Climate School Dean Ruth de Vries and John Furlow, the director of the International Research Institute for Climate and Society. And they're going to be talking about global food security and the link with climate. So thank you very much. Look forward to keeping in touch. Bye for now.